Back in January, when I asked our keynote speaker, the first keynote speaker, to join us for Peacestock, he said yes, and I was so happy that because he's a well-respected man, and I've read his books and read things in the editorial sections, and I've seen him on TV. I'm so glad that Andrew Bacevich has chosen to join us today. Mr. Bacevich grew up in Indiana, and he graduated from West Point in 1969, and he served in the Vietnam War from 1970 to 1971. He retired from the service as a rank of colonel in 1971, in the early 90s, I should say. He holds a PhD in American diplomatic history from Princeton University, and now he has joined the University at Boston and is on the faculty there presently. The American Empire Project says of his most recent book, which is out this year right now, it's called The Age of Illusions, How America Squandered Its Cold War Victory. This American Empire Project says, and I quote, it's a thought-provoking and penetrating account of the post-Cold War follies and delusions that culminated in the age of Donald Trump, end quote. Mr. Bacevich is a prolific writer in numerous political publications, and he's written many books, which include The New American Militarism, How Americans Are Seduced by War in 2005. In 2007, The Long War. In 2008, The Limits of Power, The End of American Exceptionalism. And in 2010, Washington Rules, America's Path to Permanent War.
Bill, can you hear me?
So yes, we can hear you, Andrew.
You're using up all my time on this introduction.
Glad you joined us.
Let him go.
Glad to be with you.
You're on. Thank you.
It's great to be with you. I really appreciate the opportunity to visit for a while. I fear that I am one of those pessimists that Isabel warned us against. And I don't say that particularly proudly. Maybe it's just because I'm getting too old. But it's hard for me to remain optimistic. So, like everybody else in my line of work, I'm writing a book, and the prospective title of this book is going to be After the Apocalypse. I think the subtitle will be something like America's Role in a World Transformed. And the apocalypse refers to the terrible events, not terrible, dramatic, big, some are terrible, that we are experiencing in the year 2020, 4 in particular. There's the chaos of the Trump presidency. There's the terrible consequences of the coronavirus pandemic. There's the economic collapse that then stems directly from the pandemic. And then, of course, there's the Black Lives Matter movement. I don't want to suggest that that is a negative. It is not. But certainly the Black Lives Matter movement makes it very difficult for us as Americans to look away from the reality of how divided we have become, how we have lost sight of any common commitment to an identifiable sense of values. Now, one of the effects, it seems to me, of this apocalypse that we are enduring is to distract attention from our role in the world, distract attention from U.S. foreign policy. I think right now at this moment, with the exception of growing concern about China and a possible new Cold War with China, foreign policy just isn't on the agenda. And here we are, what, 4 months before a presidential election? I see very little likelihood that foreign policy will figure in a major way in the November election. And I think that's a problem. So as Bill mentioned, I'm the president of this new think tank called the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. I have to confess to you, we are not a peace think tank. We are against war. We are against reckless interventionism. But I think our collective hopes for change are probably more modest than are most of the people who are participating in this event. We would just like to see the United States pursue a more restrained approach to foreign policy, meaning de-emphasizing the use of force, putting greater emphasis on diplomacy and dialogue. If we could get that done, the result might not be world peace, but the result might at least be fewer conflicts, less bloodshed, less money wasted on arms. So that's we're new. You know, we are a voice crying in the wilderness. We hope to have some influence on the political debate in Washington, but it really remains to be seen whether or not we'll succeed in doing that. Day after tomorrow, Monday, the Quincy Institute is releasing a major policy paper. It's a 35-page paper. It'll be posted online on our website as of Monday. And this policy paper focuses particularly on U.S. policy in the Middle East. And so my colleagues, you know, we want to get people to notice this thing and read it. So my colleagues had me write an op-ed on this subject of U.S. policy in the Middle East. The op-ed is going to appear in the Los Angeles Times on Monday morning. And what I thought I would do, maybe I don't mean to test your patience, but I thought as my formal remarks, I'll read you the op-ed. You know, it's only 800 words long. It's not going to take very long to get through it. But I think it will at least tell you a little bit about where the Quincy Institute's coming from, where I'm coming from. And then perhaps we'll set the stage for the Q&A, which is going to consume the balance of our time. So I'm looking for Bill to nod his head and say that's okay. He nodded. So I'll go ahead and quickly run through this for you. When Americans elect a president, they also choose a commander-in-chief. And for that reason, as they consider who should lead the nation, issues of war and peace are often front and center, but not this time. In our present convergence of extraordinary crises, domestic concerns, the pandemic, economic distress, demands for reckoning with pervasive racism, these domestic concerns are crowding out questions related to the nation's global role, with China a partial exception. But by and large, today, Americans show little inclination to take stock of US policy beyond our borders. Well, just as COVID-19 provides no excuse for ignoring the epidemic of deaths from drug overdoses, that's 71,000 Americans last year, so too our challenges here at home offer no excuse for tuning out the rest of the world. Now here's an important truth you won't hear from the foreign policy establishment. Since the end of the Cold War, now 3 decades ago, the United States has lost its way. The resulting pattern of failure predates President Trump. To me, that's an important point. Although candidate Trump once professed an awareness of those failures, you will recall his denunciations of what we have come to call endless wars. The record shows that as president, Trump has made things worse. Today, Policy defined as a principled and consistent pattern of behavior has ceased to exist. All that remain are noise and gestures, baffling our traditional allies and delighting those eager to take advantage of the bedlam that currently prevails in Washington. The essential problem, as I see it, is twofold. First, those responsible for charting post-Cold War U.S. policy have misconstrued U.S. core interests. Second, they have vastly overestimated and therefore recklessly misused American military power. In no part of the world is this dual failure more in evidence than in the Middle East. The proof? The trillions of dollars, and you know this, the trillions of dollars expended since 9/11 to eliminate terrorism and spread liberal values with next to nothing to show in return. The phrase global war on terrorism may have fallen out of favor, but with the possible exception of Vietnam, no foreign policy initiative in all of U.S. history can match the global war on terrorism for producing results so radically at odds with declared intentions. So I believe, and the Quincy Institute believes, there's a pressing need to reassess U.S. policy toward the Middle East, and waiting for a more convenient occasion, when things are calmer, is not an option. So with this in mind, we're just publishing a policy paper called A New Paradigm in the Middle East. Now, as many of you know, Washington is awash with policy papers that have a shelf life measured in hours, if not minutes. But we believe that this essay deserves thoughtful consideration, not simply within the Beltway, but by ordinary citizens like all of us. Our new paradigm begins with a realistic appraisal of U.S. interests, which really are two. One, protecting the United States from attacks emanating from that region. Number two, promoting the free flow of commerce. Notably, ensuring access to Persian Gulf oil per se does not qualify as a vital interest. In the near term, we don't need the oil. Our own hemisphere contains ample reserves of fossil fuels. In the longer term, we don't want the oil, the necessity of shifting to renewables having become irrefutable. This does not mean that we should walk away from the region, however. It does mean that we should approach the Middle East in different ways. A primary goal of U.S. policy should be to restore stability to a region that our own misguided affinity for coercive regime change has itself helped to destabilize. We've caused the problems. Now, stable in this context is synonymous with mutual coexistence. That's all. Peace in the Middle East, if it ever comes in our lifetime, won't look like peace in Europe, but simply encouraging a cessation of war and promoting greater economic integration constitutes a worthy and a plausible goal. Now, to move toward that goal, the United States should refrain from picking sides in regional disputes, most prominently the rivalry that pits Saudi Arabia against Iran. While pouring weaponry into the region may benefit American arms manufacturers, it does benefit arms manufacturers, the net effect is to underwrite violence with innocents all too often caught in the crossfire. Yemen today offers a specific case in point. To promote stability, the United States should reposition itself. This won't be easy. The United States should reposition itself as an honest broker committed to solving problems through diplomacy and dialogue. This implies a willingness to talk to all parties. no pariahs. And to signal this shift away from militarism toward diplomacy, the Pentagon should immediately commence a deliberate withdrawal of U.S. forces from the region. Key word there, I think, is deliberate, not overnight, but planned and phased, but it has to happen. Does this imply that the United States should turn a blind eye to violations of human rights and forego efforts to promote democracy? Not at all. But in such matters, the United States leads most effectively when it does so by example. The Black Lives Matter movement serves as a sharp reminder on that score that we have much to attend to here at home. As for governments abroad that abuse human rights, the United States should hold all offenders equally accountable. So just as there should be no pariahs, so too there should be no free passes. How does Israel figure in this new paradigm? Well, Israel in 2020 is not the young and vulnerable nation with which the United States forged a special relationship several decades ago. Israel today is vastly stronger, and its enemies are fewer and weaker. As the only nation in the Middle East possessing a nuclear strike capability, while also enjoying the region's most effective military forces, Israel is fully capable of defending itself by itself without a multi-billion-dollar annual subsidy courtesy of the American taxpayer. Disregarding U.S. objections, successive Israeli governments have continually expanded settlements on the West Bank. The result has been to effectively eliminate the possibility of creating a viable Palestinian state. Frankly, if only to preserve a sense of credibility or our own self-respect, the United States should not ratify nor endorse that action, which has been radically at odds with U.S. interests. So to put it bluntly, a new paradigm for U.S. policy in the Middle East should revisit the terms of the U.S.-Israeli special relationship. So in sum, no pariahs, no free passes, no special privileges, and no magical solutions. The Quincy Institute's new paradigm promises none. But on this point, we are insistent. The existing architecture of U.S. policy in the Middle East is nearing collapse. So acting now to devise a replacement is imperative. And the election of 2020 provides the right occasion to do just that. So I'll stop there and look forward to taking a stab at any questions that you have about this or about other matters where I think I can say something useful. Thank you.
First one.
You're live.
You're live.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. I have a question I'd like to start out with. In your book, The Age of Illusions, you stated, and I quote, "Truth took a back seat to expedience." Could you expound on that some more?
What was I talking about? What's the context of the quote?
Well, just the idea that truth took a back seat to expedience.
I mean, again, I don't know exactly where that fits in the book.
How does it fit into our foreign policy?
Well, I mean, I think that this tends to be part of politics, where decision makers are driven by expediency, by what they perceive to be necessary at a particular time, even if that is at odds with larger truths or basic principles. And the problem with allowing expediency to determine policy is that I think, expediency works in the short term. And in the long term, it tends to fail, to be exposed as false, less than truthful. And so I think that there is a need, to, in policy circles, or in those among us who sort of observe and critique policy, there's a need to push back against this tendency for expediency to dominate.
Do you think this is for the
Ask another
speaker?
one.
Next.
I have a question, but I'm not sure if it's directly to you, but I'm going to ask it since it's the first question that came up. How do you think we should how should we think about the rise of China versus America? And I'm not sure if it's a general question or if it's a question specifically too, so I don't know if you want to answer that, Andrew.
Sounds like a general question.
That's kind of what I thought too, but it came out like 5 minutes after you started, so I didn't know. The next question is...
Don't. Stick with China.
Okay.
It's a great question.
It's my first time doing this.
It's okay. It's my first time at Peacestock. So I think there are two dominant issues in our time, from a foreign policy perspective, not from a domestic foreign policy perspective. And the two challenges. And the first challenge is climate change, which I think poses an existential threat to our civilization, to our existence, to our way of life, and to everybody else on the planet. So that's challenge number one. Challenge number two is the rise of China. What I'm about to say is not an anti-China comment, but it is simply, I think, a truth that history has demonstrated over and over again, and that is the rise of a new power is necessarily disruptive, because a new power inevitably, I think, will engage in an effort to understand how it is supposed to fit in the world order. Will engage in an internal process of trying to understand what it needs, what it requires, what it aspires to. And the rise of a new power also makes everybody else nervous. I mean, in many respects, I think we are an example of that, by the way. The rise of the United States to the status of great power, more or less in the latter part of the 19th century, made a lot of people in Europe nervous. Who the heck are these Americans and what do they want? But the classic example really is the one we're most familiar with, I think, is Germany. Until 1870, 1871, Germany consisted of a bunch of little states. Not all of them were little. Prussia was formidable. But the unification of all those states into this thing called Germany, large, powerful, and for its day, advanced technology, advanced industry, and big ambitions, made a whole lot of people nervous. Particularly the French and the British. So the central geopolitical issue of the latter part of the 19th century and into the 20th century was how can Europe accommodate the rise of Germany without having the place blow up? And of course, they failed. 1914, they ended up with a war that led to yet another war in 1939. Not simply war, but also led to various revolutions, ultimately led to the Cold War. So I don't mean to suggest that there's a precise parallel, but I think there is at least a useful comparison can be made with the rise of China here in the 21st century. We need to come to some understanding of what the Chinese leadership intends. What do they aspire to? Where do they think they fit? And we need to figure out a way to try to ensure that their ambitions do not collide with our own in fundamental ways. So we need to negotiate peaceful coexistence with China. When I say we here, I don't just mean the United States. I mean all of the other developed nations, particularly those that are in the region, Japan, India, but the rest of the planet as well. So this is a huge, huge, huge problem. Now, the saving grace might be that climate change poses as much of a threat to China as it does to us. So I believe if we could pursue a course of enlightened statecraft, we could find a way to reach an agreement with China on those areas where our interests coincide. And if we could do that, then the matters where our interests do not coincide might be less explosive, less dangerous. But we are a long, long way from being able to get there.
Andrew, yeah, I agree with you. We need to use a lot more diplomacy, but I see our country using threats with diplomacy, because we often hear the term, everything's on the table, and that includes nuclear weapons. I'm sorry, that's the way these people look at it from us.
I disagree with you. I fundamentally disagree with you. So yes, the rhetoric of all things, options are on the table is commonplace. It is not helpful.
Yeah, we have to get
apply the use of force. I don't believe it actually implies a nuclear threat.
well, I don't know if they always take it that way, but anyway.
No,
Okay.
Bill, it might, that kind of language in the 1950s and into the 1960s did implicitly include a nuclear threat. If we recall the Cuban Missile Crisis as an example, a vivid example. But my sense would be that probably by the 1980s, certainly after the Cold War is over, that there's I think a general recognition among our policymakers, probably also Russian policymakers, Chinese policymakers, that any use of nuclear weapons would have such catastrophic effects as to, end civilization. Now, when I say that, I'm not suggesting that Pakistani policymakers or Indian policymakers or Israeli policymakers necessarily share that view. So I'm not trying to tell you that the nuclear threat, the nuclear danger has gone away. It hasn't gone away. I don't believe that for a second. But I don't believe that and you're right to point it out, this penchant for us in our language to be constantly threatening, this sort of or else kind of rhetoric. It is wrong-headed, it's counterproductive. I just don't think that it includes a threat to go nuclear on our part.
Okay, let's open up, yeah.
I have a question from Edward. Mr. Bacevich, are there any generals or admirals, active or retired, who agree with you and the Quincy Institute policy statement, and have they or will they speak?
Well, I don't, it's not like I'm in close contact with the military. I'm not. I got out of the Army in 1992. It's now 28 years ago. That said, we have a retired Army general by the name of Paul Eaton, E-A-T-O-N, who is a member of our board, of the Quincy Institute's board, and who would be very sympathetic with the themes of Peacestock. Matter of fact, he lives out in Washington State, and he runs an organization, I believe it's called Vote Vets, which certainly has a peace orientation. So he's a retired guy, he's not an active guy, but he's a fine guy. And Paul Eaton is at least one person who I think would be sympathetic with much of what we're talking about.
The next question is, I believe, from Michael. In your work and research, how have you seen Middle East feminist movements play a role in U.S.-ME relations, specifically in Palestine?
I don't know. When I was still teaching at BU, I had a young woman from Saudi Arabia who was a student. She was a graduate student. Most impressive. Intelligent, well-informed, open-minded. And I must say that teaching her and interacting with her, and this is just one person, this is not like a Gallup poll, but did give me some appreciation for the aspirations of women in that part of the world. But again, this was this is not a result of sort of deep study. I don't know much about the political activism of Palestinian students. My opinion of Palestinian leadership, which I think is almost exclusively male, is that Palestinian leadership has been utterly ineffective in advancing the interests of the Palestinian people.
The next question is from Mike. Andrew, what can you comment on the Trump administration's decimation of the State Department diplomatic corps?
Yeah, it's happened. I guess there's a larger context here. And the larger context is that, particularly since the end of the Cold War, that's 30 years ago now, policy elites in general have believed that the way to get things done is to call on the Pentagon. And we go back here to the all options on the table and the willingness to use force. It's astonishing to count up the number of interventions that we have undertaken since the Cold War ended, beginning as soon as it ended, beginning in December of 1989 with the intervention in Panama. Excuse me just for a second. So that has led, I think, to a tendency to under-resource the State Department. And I think there's a second tendency, and that is a tendency to sort of rely on the superstar Secretary of State. Examples would be, Hillary Clinton, Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice. I mean, superstar in the sense that they kind of high profile, a lot of press. And the problem with emphasizing the role of the Secretary of State is that then it leads to an underemphasis on the role of everybody else who worked for the Secretary of State. So there is a real need to rebuild the State Department, which means also to rebuild and reform the Foreign Service, our professional diplomatic corps. But I think it's often been said that the State Department doesn't have any domestic constituency. No, the Pentagon has a constituency that extends to all 50 states and every congressional district. So when it comes to talking about whether to, build a new weapon system or close a base or open a base, there's a lot of congressmen who are going to get real interested real fast. But But when the issue was, should we close down, 5 consulates in Africa to save money? Who speaks up on behalf of the 5 consulates in Africa? So the State Department doesn't have the same kind of political clout that the Pentagon does. I don't know how to fix that, but it is a factor that interferes with ensuring that the State Department is adequately resourced.
The next question is from Paula. How does the current election offer opportunity to shift the paradigm when we are still choosing from candidates of the status quo?
Well, that's a good question. That's an excellent question. And I think the answer in a way is implicit in the question. That, go back to the prior point that I think Pat made, previous speaker, that Americans are sort of tuning out our wars, which I agree with. So those of us who care about those wars and care about our role in the world, I think we need to beat the drum saying the choices are inadequate. Biden published an essay in Foreign Affairs maybe 2 or 3 months ago, the big magazine on foreign policy. And it was a call for continuing American global leadership, and we will stay strong, and nobody's going to push us around. No, you could say, well, that's just what candidates say, and it is what they say. But it also, that the fact that he would agree to have that essay published, I doubt if he wrote it, is indicative of the absence of any real critical thought at the highest levels of the political establishment. In that never-ending primary season, and all those debates, we started out with what, two nights with 10 Democrats on the stage each night, just trying to whittle things down. And you remember the one Democrat who actually had something serious, had something interesting to say, went off script, as it were, was Tulsi Gabbard. And it seemed to me that the Democratic establishment wanted her to go away, didn't want to hear her skeptical message. She was not welcome on those stages. And I think that antipathy toward her, because she wasn't buying into this global leadership stuff, is suggestive of how far we have to go before we're going to have a serious debate about our role in the world. Because everybody's drinking from the same pitcher of Kool-Aid.
This one's from Gregory. There's a lot of questions that are coming up about the election, but I try to pick some different ones here. This one's from Gregory. Do you think there are more people in power now who are so invested in getting their way that they'd rather wipe out civilization than lose or not get their way?
No, I don't think anybody wants to wipe out the civilization. I'm not sure who Gregory has in mind. Politicians, I think, to the person, wish to retain power and, if possible, to expand their power, their influence. And with that goal in mind, they will do foolish and stupid things, say foolish and stupid things. And they will say things that, from your point of view and my point of view, we might say, this is madness. But I don't think the motivation is to try to blow up the world. the motivation, however ill-considered and reckless, is to advance their own political fortunes or the political fortunes of their, whoever they think they represent.
Thanks.
Here's a question from Afghanistan. Dear Andrew, my name is Mohammed. I apologize for the pronunciation, and I'm from Afghanistan. And my question is, what do you think of U.S. war with Afghanistan? Is there a way out? The U.S. and the Afghans lose its soldiers on a day-to-day basis. What do you consider the ultimate solution?
Well, this is one of the great tragedies of our time. And the war in Afghanistan ranks up there right alongside the war in Iraq as an epic failure on the part of the United States. So we started back in 2001, intent on bringing about regime change in Kabul, believing that once we overthrew the Taliban, we will be able to install a government that would be effective, legitimate, command the support of the Afghan people, and be able to keep internal order. And we've been at that now for 19 years, and we have failed. And we could say another 19 years, and we would still have failed. So simply looking at it from a U.S. point of view, the only way to end a war is for us to leave, which is what Trump has said he intends to do, but he hasn't managed to pull it off yet. And therefore, to allow the Afghan people to solve their own problems, which is what we should have done in the first place. I don't think I'm naive in that regard. That, solving their own problems is going to, in the near term, result in more violence. But our efforts have done nothing except to encourage violence. But the presence of the United States there assumes that we have the power to fix Afghanistan, however you want to define fix. And all the evidence shows we don't have that power. And therefore we have to leave.
Do you have a question, Bill?
Oh, I do. Andrew, do you expect more and more distrust of our leaders by the military? Since you were in the military, you probably thought, how would I react to the present mission that's put upon our military? How would I react and what would I do? Your friend Danny Sershin says that more and more military are questioning our government's foreign policy and war, how we conduct war. Do you agree? Do you think that's...
I don't know. Danny has he's far closer to the active force than I am. He's still got friends that are serving. I don't know anybody that's serving. So if he says that's true, it probably is true. It is certainly the case that some of President Trump's shenanigans, and of course the famous walk across Lafayette Square would be the most vivid example. But I think it's certainly true that some of his shenanigans cause great unease within the ranks of senior military officers. It's notable that after that stunt, General Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who was berated by many people, to include me, for participating in that event, that he made a speech. This is on public record, acknowledging that he had made a mistake in accompanying the president on that, stroll. That Trump had induced him to cross a very important line that suggested that the military is becoming politicized, becoming an instrument of Trump, as opposed an instrument that serves the nation in accordance with the Constitution. So my guess, it's only a guess because I don't know these people. My guess is that at the present moment there's an awareness of the need to steer clear of politics and preserve the military's reputation for being apolitical. Now, when I say apolitical, I mean apolitical staying out of partisan politics, and some of your participants will be quick to say, you know, quit pulling my leg. The military is political, and it is in the sense that, you know, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marine Corps have certain institutional interests, and the leaders of those services will play politics in order to advance their interests, to increase their budget share, to get the Congress to you know, fund some particularly important weapons program. So in that sense, the military plays politics, but with rare exceptions, it stays out of the line of fire of partisan politics. And I think one of the really dangerous things that Trump is doing is that he seems disinclined to respect that.
Skip asked the question, in my lifetime I saw the collapse of the Soviet Union, the old USSR, due primarily to the overspending of its military might. Do you think that it is possible now with our own country, as it spends realistically nearly $1 trillion every year on, quote, defense, close quote, well over half of our discretionary spending budget?
I didn't understand what the question was.
I think his question is, do you think that the possibility of us spending
Are we going to collapse? No, we're not going to
Yeah.
collapse. No, we're not going to collapse. We're spending too much money on the military. We're spending it foolishly. We're spending it pursuant to policies that maybe made sense back during the Cold War, but don't make sense today. We're spending all that money with an absence of any serious debate in Washington about these matters. But I don't think that the republic is in jeopardy.
Larry asks, have you identified any sources of intellectual pollution in the policy debate that's making it more to establish a pro-peace policy?
Well, I mean, intellectual pollution could be a good phrase to use. I mean, I am just struck continually by the failure of our political establishment to seriously evaluate the consequences of what we used to call the global war on terrorism. Consequently, the whole thing is a fiasco. You know, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, oh my God. And yet there seems to be this just absolute refusal to look at what we said we were going to do, then look at what actually happened, and to then weave in the costs involved. You know, dollars, people killed, people maimed, a political system that's you know, the upheaval of the political upheaval leading to Trumpism. It doesn't get talked about. So I think that's a form of intellectual corruption that ought to be remedied.
Okay, Andrew. Again, I have another question. Throughout our history, American history, we've spoken lies. They weren't intended to be lies when they were first spoken, but our Native Americans are acutely aware of the lies that were perpetrated upon them. And I think the world is becoming acutely aware of lies that we might be disseminating. So how can we regain the truth or the trust of the world? I think we've lost a lot of trust amongst the people and the governments of the world. What's a couple things we could do right now to regain the trust?
I think I'd probably give the same answer to that question as I did to the last one. Demonstrate an awareness of what we have done, of the mayhem we have caused. And having demonstrated an awareness, then have a serious debate about, oh, well, then what ought to be America's role in the world? Yeah. I think that in and of itself might reassure nations, predisposed to be friendly to us, that we're not all brain dead. But I mean, that presumes moral and intellectual courage that doesn't seem to be much in supply in Washington.
It seems like you talked about U.S. core values. Maybe a lot of people have forgotten what they are. Could you remind us what these core values we should get back to?
Well, I mean, they're stated in the Declaration of Independence. They're enumerated in the Constitution of the United States. The words are good and sound. The application has been imperfect. We have been slow. We declare universal values. We are very slow in applying those values universally. It's sort of like special people get special privileges. I mean, that's been the story of my life. I'm privileged, and I think this is one of the encouraging things about the Black Lives Matter movement, which of course now spills over into others' lives, is that this does appear to be potentially a moment of real reckoning. We'll see how it plays out. We thought that there was a reckoning with racism that was happening in the 1960s, and certain gains were made and other things, were forgotten. And so we're trying again.
Okay.
I'm going to combine two different questions together. One is from Mamie. She wanted to know, how can we get a Department of Peace? And Rich asked, what tools might we reduce the threats of nuclear war, a new start, a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, or stop funding the modernization of nuclear arsenal? I think these kind of seem to be like a theme.
Yeah, I don't think we need a Department of Peace. We have a Department of State. The Department of State is supposed to conduct diplomacy. Diplomacy is interacting with other nation states in ways to try to solve problems short of war. So this goes back to our earlier conversation. The problem is the Department of State is underfunded and ill-respected and doesn't have a lot of clout. That's a problem that I think could be fixed. I don't think we need yet another cabinet department. I'm not sure what it would do. There is a United States Institute of Peace in Washington, and I think it's a fine organization. I'm sure it does useful things, but since it came into existence, I don't think it's brought the world closer to peace. I think on nuclear weapons, I think as a practical matter, well, two things we should do. One is we should cancel the $1 trillion nuclear modernization program that we began under President Obama, that over the course of the next roughly 15 years, I think, going to have new submarines, new bombers, new warheads, new everything. Unbelievable that this is going on with virtually zero public discussion. So we should undo that. And I think the second thing that I would advocate is we should adopt an explicit program of no first use. That we will not, under any circumstances, be the first ones to use nuclear weapons against an adversary. That doesn't mean that we are necessarily forswearing the use of nuclear weapons in retaliation of a nuclear attack against us. So, at least for the interim, we would maintain nuclear weapons, but exclusively for a deterrent purpose. So successive administrations have refused to embrace no first use, which therefore, and this kind of goes back, I guess, to Bill's, earlier question about all options are on the table. Our refusal to, abrogate no first use does suggest that there may be some scenarios out there where we would be the first ones to pull the trigger. I think that's dangerous. I think we could commit ourselves to no first use without any significant danger to the United States.
One more question?
Well, no, we got 10 minutes.
We got a few more questions.
I got
Have
two.
you seen any discussion in the policy world on the subject of new methods of conflict resolution?
Hey guys, just that conversation about how much time we got left. My wife and I are going to 4:30 Mass. It's now 3:57. I understood we were gonna, adjourn at 4, which would give me time to
Yeah, I think we should.
change my T-shirt and
Okay,
drive to church.
we'll honor that. We don't want you to miss church.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
We've,
Say again the question?
The question was, have you seen any discussion in the policy world on the subject of new methods of conflict resolution?
Well, one of my colleagues in the Quincy Institute is a woman by the name of Suzanne DiMaggio. And she has come to be a specialist in what they call track 2 diplomacy, which I didn't really know much about. But what track two says is where there is a troubled relationship between two countries, where there are problems, and also where there's an absence of trust, that track 2 means that there will be unofficial, informal interlocutors from both sides who would meet and try to promote each side's understanding of what the problem is, and to try to find some amounts of overlap, common interests. In other words, the track 2 tries to lay the basis for track 1 diplomacy. That's where the officials of both sides get together. They're trying to lay the basis for the track 1 diplomacy actually to get something done. And I'm persuaded that can be very useful. It does, this requires patience. We don't just get together for lunch. Discussions and discussions and discussions and meetings. But I've become a fan of track 2.
okay. Well, we're so thankful that you could be with us today, Andrew, and enlighten us on a lot of things. And
My pleasure. It's fun.
Okay.
Good question.
Thanks again. Okay. Thank
Off to
you.
church.
Take care now. Bye.